Travis Spence, the head of technical services at the University of Arizona's James E. Rogers College of Law since February 2016. Prior to that, Travis worked as a systems librarian and database manager at Pima Community College. He began his library career as a cataloger and later was a library instruction program coordinator at Ball State University in Indiana.
I'm Travis Spence. I'm the head of library technical services at the James E. Rogers College of Law in Tucson, Arizona. I wanted to talk a little bit about the situation that we're in here in Arizona and the process I went through updating our own disaster plan. So Tucson doesn't have a lot of hurricanes or no earthquakes, and we have an occasional wildfire and things like that, but very few things that really affect the library. In the time that I've been here, we've had a little bit of minor flooding and power outages during the stormy season in the summer, but most of our disasters are actually pretty minor. They're more along the lines of the minor water incidents that Gerald talked about earlier. We don't face a lot of kind of catastrophes, but we did have a pretty thorough disaster preparedness plan that had been created by my predecessor. And when he left and I took the job, I volunteered to take over the management of the plan. The old plan had originally been published by Hine in 1988, and a lot of other libraries over the years have been using it as a model for their own plans. And our plan had been kept up very well over the years, and it was very good, very thorough with a lot of resources. But the last major revision was about 10 years ago. It had been in 2010, not long after a big remodel. So Hine asked if we would be able to provide a new edition. So I said, yeah, I could go ahead and update it for them to publish. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the issues I encountered updating an older kind of plan. If you come across this, if you have a similar plan, you come across some of these things, these are some things just to be on the lookout for. I wanted to talk a little bit about the actual format of the plan. Luckily, I had both a print copy of the previous edition and all the electronic files that my predecessor had created in publishing the previous edition. Unfortunately, all the files were in Word 2007, and they had actually been created in an even older version of Word. So all the file conversions over time had made the files almost impossible to work with. After struggling with this for a while, I eventually decided to just start over. My first suggestion is if you have an older file like that, copy the text that you want and save and paste without formatting in a new document. And I freely admit that's probably something that's very obvious to everybody in the world but me, but I really struggled with the formatting for a while until I decided just to start over. I am not one of those people who is really proficient in Word and great at formatting Word documents. Thankfully, the College of Law Marketing Department had branded Word templates for us to use, so I snagged one of those and dumped our content in there, and it made the formatting much easier, and it made it look much more professional and polished, and I was really happy with the outcome. And this is the story I like to tell. When I was working with the original file, I had made some edits, and then I printed out a section so I could mark it up, and I noticed every page was page 2. So that was the point when I gave up on trying to work with the old document and just started over with a fresh Word document. Another thing about our formatting was it just looked really dated. The old guide had a lot of mismatched clip art, things like this that were printed throughout the guide and throughout the sections that we print to keep, like at the reserve desk or the reference desk and the circulation desk. I decided to delete all those just to make the guide less busy and easier to read. Another thing that I encountered was the previous version was really wordy. There were a lot of long paragraphs and a lot of explanatory text that eventually just got summarized in a bullet point at the end of the section anyway. So I decided just for ease of reading and usability to stick with bulleted lists for the most part and to describe the steps that people need to take in response to emergencies. I just find that to be a much more contemporary way to relay a lot of information quickly. And I think at this point, most people are more used to reading bullet lists for instructions than they are reading like a big block of text. So another suggestion I would have is if your plan has a lot of dense paragraphs and a lot of long blocks of text, break it up into bullet points. It just makes it so much easier to read and to use when the time comes. Another thing I found was a lot of the assumptions made in the plan were kind of outdated. A lot of our action items didn't match what was suggested by the university's risk management office or the incident response team. So I decided to bring the library's plan as close as possible to matching what was being done at the College of Law and at the university in general, just to make it easier for training and continuity in case of a disaster that's affecting a large area. If we're off doing our own thing and not matching up with what the university is expecting, it could lead to some problems. So I would suggest checking with your parent organization if you have one, or others in your organization, like your facilities people, to make sure you aren't contradicting each other, or that you're drafting a plan that somebody else has already drafted a plan for. I also noticed a lot of the terminology in our plan was kind of outdated. The thing that stood out to me the most was the phrase armed individual was used throughout the section on how to deal with that kind of thing. I replaced all those instances with active shooter. I think that phrase is more meaningful to people in this day and age than armed individual. We had some other just clunky sounding terminology that I updated, like mobility impaired persons and computer emergency. So yeah, just be on the lookout for that kind of thing, and update the terminology to make it meaningful to people currently working in your institution. Be aware that some of the responses that were built into your plan from external organizations may have changed over time, or people's behavior have just changed over time. The example that I point to in our older guide was in almost every disaster response scenario in our old plan, it called for finding a landline phone and calling 911. And there was no mention of cell phones or other current technology in the library plan. And it was good that we did look into that, because when we invited the university police in to do a security audit and we were talking about these kinds of things, they pointed out that landline 911 calls are routed differently than cell phone 911 calls. So I was able to mention that in our updated plan so people would know they might get a slightly different response time calling from one type of phone or the other. Another very important thing we learned in updating with the university police was what actually happens when we trigger our panic button system. It wasn't very well documented in the old plan what happens when somebody actually presses our silent alarm. We had kind of been working under the assumption that it would just trigger a call back from the police, or that the police would just show up to inquire what was going on. But when we had our follow-up with the university police, they told us that they actually take these silent alarms very seriously and they treat them as an extreme emergency. They'll respond with guns drawn and ready to fire. So when I updated the plan, I made sure to be very clear about what happens when the silent alarm is pressed, and describing the appropriate circumstances to actually use the panic button. So yeah, if you're relying on like a response from like a university police department or your local police, it's a really good idea to check in with them, as others have said. Build those relationships so you know what to expect in case of an emergency. And they will also learn your facility. They'll get familiar with the kinds of people that you serve and who are going to be around, and they will be better prepared in case they need to come to your institution. A lot of people have made that point today, and I'll stress it again because I do think it's really important, is to check with the people who will be responding to your emergencies and build out those relationships. Another thing that I had noticed in updating our plan was that there were some types of emerging threats that weren't really covered. Our old plan, like I said, had originally been written in the 80s, and it had very little information on current kind of IT stuff. It mostly discussed what to do in case of a power outage or if a computer was damaged, but there was really no information about IT security, phishing attempts, data breaches, or anything like that. Part of the revision was linking out to the university's IT security department and including information for people facing those kinds of problems. Another thing that wasn't really covered very well in the previous edition, which is more unfortunately prevalent today, is the whole issue with an active shooter. There was not a separate section in the old plan for active shooters. There was just a brief discussion of armed individuals and a section about disruptive behavior. So I pulled active shooter into its own section and build it out with more instructions on what to do following the university's updated guidance. And we also called the university police back in to do active shooter training, and we got on a regular schedule with them to do active shooter training and also with the local paramedics to do CPR training every 2 years. And something else that hadn't been covered in our old guide was bed bug infestations. The college had recently had a bed bug problem, so I went ahead and added that into the plan. Where I kind of tripped up, though, was in the part on it. We did have a section in the guide on infectious diseases. I didn't really update all that much. All I did was link to the university's pandemic response plan. And as I was writing this in the late summer and early fall of 2019, I really had no idea that that was going to become like the big emergency that we were going to have to face. So shortly after I sent my revision to Hein, they asked if I could expand on the pandemic section for a tip-in, which I did. In that section, I described the library's response to COVID-19 and how we had transitioned to working from home and how we had restricted access to the building and the other things that we had done. So it's good to try to imagine emerging disaster tides, but I think you can just know that you're never going to be able to anticipate everything that could happen. I think even the previous presenter mentioned that a pandemic was like a low probability but high impact kind of event. Yeah, last summer when I was updating this guide, I thought a pandemic was a very low probability, but that was the thing that we ended up dealing with the most. So just keep that in mind, that you're never going to be able to envision all the possible scenarios that you might want to cover. Something else that I had noticed when I was updating our old guide, it didn't really reflect the organizational culture of the library at this point. In the old plan, there were very clear instructions that staff were just to report things to librarians and let librarians take over. There were a couple of problems with that approach. We've changed how the library is staffed, and there are a lot of hours during the nights and weekends when there's just not a librarian present. And in general, staff these days have more responsibility and authority than apparently they had back in the 80s when this plan was originally drafted. So I updated the language to reflect what staff can and should do in case of an emergency, and not focus on relying on them to alert somebody else to take action when they see something happening and then report it or bring in administration when it's safe to do so. So just be aware of that your older plan may not really reflect your institutional values. So if you want to build that into your plan, I think that's a good idea. Another thing about our old plan is that it wasn't very accessible. It was, like I said, a printed book that Hein had generated. We had generated other sections to print in binders to put around various places in the library. But those binders were really hard to access in case of an actual emergency, and they were really hard to remember to keep updated with minor changes. So what I eventually did was I created a version of our disaster plan and put it up on our LiveGuides platform. So everybody has access to it there. It's much easier to maintain, and it's mobile friendly. If people need to look it up on the go to find like the phone tree or anything like that in case of an actual emergency, they don't have to go looking for a binder and try to dig out the information that they need from a binder. So if you can put your revised guide up in the cloud somewhere that makes it easier for people to access, that's probably a good idea too. Just to wrap up, you really don't have to reinvent the wheel when you update your plan. There are a lot of sections in our old plan that I just tweaked a very little and carried over into the new version. But there were a lot of things that really need to be updated. So just depending on your institution and how long it's been since your plan was updated, it might take a little more work or might take a little less work. But I think the important thing that I learned was to look at every part of the plan critically, look at the terminology, look at how people are currently behaving, the responses that you're likely to get from your local authorities, look at your organizational culture. Does it reflect that? And do you take advantage of new technology in terms of making this guide available to people? Like I said, the thing that I learned most from updating this was there are a lot of facets to not only the plan, but how it's formatted and how it's presented and how people interact with it. So take all of those things into consideration when you're updating your plan. So there's my email address, and these slides will be shared. And if you have any questions later on, just let me know. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? We do have one comment in here saying that it's better to call 911 from a landline if possible. The physical location is attached to a landline, but there's often a delay getting the location information on a cell phone, even if it has GPS enabled.
That's true. And the other thing that we found out was if you're on our campus and you call 911 from a landline, it gets routed to the University Police Department. But if you're on campus and you call from your cell phone, it gets routed to Tucson Police, and they then coordinate with UAPD. So yeah, it's just really important to know the response that you're going to get. So double check that.
That's a really good tip. And now, Travis, there's another question for you. How many colleagues did you include in your planning?
So we have an entire disaster action team that was included in the planning. It consists of a couple of librarians and several staff members. We also have a few members from the College of Law itself, because we want to coordinate with whatever they're doing in terms of disaster planning. So it ended up being about 8 or 10 people, I think, and everybody contributed to the plan.
And then another question for you, Travis. How long did it take to update/recreate your plan?
Because there was so much revision that needed to be done, and it wasn't my full-time job, it ended up taking probably a little over a year to get the whole thing revised.
Here we go, Travis, another one. Did you align your plan with the plan at the College of Law?
Yes, we did. Like I said, we had participation on our disaster team with people on the College of Law side. So they're aware of what we're doing, and we're aware of what they're doing in terms of disasters. The training that we did, the active shooter training and the CPR training, we coordinated with the College of Law and opened it up to everyone, not just the library. So yeah, we work pretty closely with them.